If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. I was thinking about a piece I read a while back, and I'll get to that in a minute, but first I want to motivate that a little bit with another story. So I'm going to tell you this story so I can tell you the other story. The purpose of this podcast, this episode, is so that we can talk about the best ways to deal with the notion of information overload. And it comes under a bunch of different names, but for now, we'll just say information overload. And how do we deal with the fact, practically, how do we deal with the fact that there's more information out there than we can possibly consume? And how do we mentally adjust to doing that? So, both practically, how do we set ourselves up so that we're not overwhelmed? And then mentally, how do we think about this stuff so that we begin to avoid fear of missing out, all these different kinds of ideas. And I want to walk you through this because this is an important concept to grasp on the way to doing busy right. Because if we try to collect everything, if we try to somehow process even a measurable percentage of the information that's available to us, then we're going to face an immense challenge. And so, how do we go about that, and how do we think about doing that? David Allen, some while back, did a talk, and he was talking about information overload, and he was being kind of funny, and he said, there's no such thing as information overload, because if there was, when you walked into a library, your head would explode. And I just thought that was an amusing way to say it. And he's right. And he didn't, I don't recall that he went into any detail, but that's where I'm going to tell you the second story, the second piece that really triggered this episode. But the amount of information available to us has really always been kind of beyond our ability to process. If you go into any reasonable sized library, particularly now in the electronic age, you look at all the information that's available and all the print assets that they have, and then add in all the information that's available in all the electronic assets that they have. It really would be impossible to consume all of that. And we'd think that the effort would be weird. If somebody says, hey, I'm going to go into the library and I'm going to start over here in this corner in the top left of that shelf, and I'm going to read everything in order. Well, first of all, it's going to change rapidly enough that that's not possible. And secondly, why would you do that? And when we think about these sorts of things, it's only getting an increasing amount of information. It's only more and more as we move into the electronic publishing age and these sorts of things. And this is a problem that we're all pretty familiar with. And I think that we just try to live with it. But some more practical advice and some more effective ways to think about it, I think, are useful. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to reduce some of your stress around the amount of information available in this world. The other story that I'll tell you is a guy named Clay Shirky, who may still be fairly well known. I think he might have done most of his work in the previous decade, but anyway, it doesn't matter, because he said this thing that it's not information overload, it's filter failure. And when he says that, what he means is we constantly have to filter the amount of information we try and consume. Now, in the physical world, it's a little bit easier because we have things like space constraints, and we have other issues with trying to consume everything. But I mean, it's at least theoretically possible that somebody might try. But he talks about filter failure, and this is a fairly old piece, and he's using email as an example, and he's saying that we do have these capabilities of putting filters on information, and that's a very human thing to do. Since we can't consume everything, we put filters, and that means that we're predicting what we want to see and eliminating the things that we don't want to see. And I think that's a good philosophical approach, because a filter is something that is either useful or not useful. It either performs according to its purpose, that is, it lets the good things through, or it doesn't. And then it's something that we can adjust and tinker, and over time becomes better and better and better, and over time adapts to the changing information environment. So when you're thinking about information, I would suggest that you think filters, and we'll talk a little bit about how and why that works better. First, I want to define for you the concept of an information channel. An information channel is really any source of information that we want to consume. It's our email feed, it's chat, it's conversations with other people, it's places that we go to hear things, even movie theaters. All of these things are information channels because they're sources of information for us. And at the individual channel level, we really can operate pretty well, as compared to sitting back and going, wow, there's too much information. I'm overwhelmed. I don't even know where to start. So if we look at it information channel by information channel, I think that helps us. Now, I'm not at this point going to try to define information. I spent 6 years in a PhD program pondering this very question, and there are lots of different answers. I'll just say we know it when we see it. Information is some communication from some other source of stuff. Now, when we think about information channels, so information channels carry information. We can also note that some channels are better and some are worse in terms of the usefulness or applicability of the information that they provide to us. Some are better and some are worse in the sense that some are curated and there's less junk and they're more focused. And we can say, well, this information channel, Forbes magazine comes to mind. It's all about business, economic information. And if you want to take a look at that kind of information, that's a pretty good source in terms of its focus, and it's not going to bring in a whole lot of extraneous things. So that's one way that we filter. And we'll talk more about that later. I'll say there is an interesting phenomenon relating to filters that's happening over the last decade or so. And that's the social media contract. And I'll have a lot more to say about the social media contract. But when we think about social media, there's filters that are available on that as well. And thinking about how can we get better at using our filters? How can we improve our filters such that good stuff gets to us and stuff that's a waste of our time doesn't get to us? So thinking about that as well. But there's a real interesting issue around the social media contract, and we'll get into that. But social media, the reason I'm bringing it up is it's another information channel. And a precise definition of an information channel, well, is my friend feed one information channel and general information another channel? That's probably too precise for what we're trying to do here. But you may want to look into that as another filtering mechanism. So I mentioned before, defining information is quite slippery, and people have been trying to do it for a long, long time. But One thing that I believe we can all agree on about information is information really needs our attention in order to be useful. In other words, information that's in a closed book is not useful to us, nor are we readily able to judge the quality of the information. So information needs our attention in two ways. One is it needs our attention in the sense of, is this valuable information for me? Is it useful information? Or even, is it likely true information? And then the other aspect of attention is that that's the way information changes from being an inert thing to being something that's useful for us, is that we give it our attention. We can have a book that's great, but if we don't read it, it's fairly useless, except as a paper holder. So that's really interesting about information. And really one of the things that I think drives our concern about information overload. And by that, I mean, there's information out there, but I have to attend to that information in order to determine whether or not it's important for me. And that's attention that I don't have enough of to inspect all of the information that's available. And this is down the line of maybe fear of missing out, this kind of thinking. And we know that information by itself doesn't usually call out to us. It doesn't usually have any way of getting our attention if it doesn't already have our attention. Now, this is not a bright line, but again, a closed book on your bookshelf, you learn to ignore it and you walk past it and it doesn't shout out and say, hey, read me, read me. Now, we have adapted and added tools such that our information does call out to us. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. And here I'll distinguish or try to distinguish information as information from an alert. An alert is something that impinges itself on our attention. It's designed to do that, or we're designed for it to do that, whichever way you want to look at it. And I'm thinking about the roar of a predator on the ancient savannah, the sound of thunder on the horizon, right? These are alerts. And I won't say that there's no information in an alert, but there's very little information in an alert. An alert is a ringing bell, as in an alarm clock. An alert is a siren when you're driving down the road. And other than, hey, pay attention, many of these things carry actually fairly little information in and of themselves. And that becomes important when we start looking at filters and how maybe we misuse filters. The point here is that information and attention are tightly linked. And we understand at some visceral level, even if we haven't really thought about it, that information, in order to be useful, requires our attention. And our attention is a pretty scarce commodity at present and probably for the future. So information and attention are pretty tightly linked, which is why it's an important topic for us as we think about our own use of attention. So we talked about information channels, and information channels is really any distinct source of information. And if you think of them as individual channels, then it's easier to deal with them, classify them, coordinate them. And an information channel carries the information that the sender wants it to carry. Wants being a kind of a heavy term. Some signals we get on information channels, nobody actually sends it to us. It just occurs. But leaving that aside for the time being, information channels carry the content that the producer of that channel wants it to carry. So a magazine is an information channel, an issue of a magazine, and it has articles in it that the publisher wanted to put in there. And that may or may not be completely in line with the information that we would like to spend our attention on, that we would like to get value from, or that we think has a high probability of being valuable. And so that's a really interesting thing about channels. And particularly in the modern day, there are channels that, quite frankly, anybody can put information on. And we'll get back to that when we talk about the social media contract. So filters then, relating to information channels, filters are the technologies that we use in order to try to keep the stuff that has a low probability of value from attracting any of our attention. And the notion of a filter is a physical thing. Some filters are more like earplugs in that they attempt to not let anything through, right? It's a very absolute filter. It's not really a filter at all as much as it is a closed door. So closing or turning off an information channel. And then other filters are more gentle in the sense that they are much looser and more stuff comes through. But the real takeaway with filters is that it's a technology, and it can be made better or worse. It can be tuned up in order to perform better to our purposes. If you think of a paper coffee filter versus a mesh strainer, there are two different tools that behave in two different ways. One lets a lot more stuff through, a lot bigger particles come through, and the other is a little bit finer. The coffee filter is a little bit finer. And really the only thing that gets through a coffee filter sort of is water, versus a strainer that will get little bits of stuff through. So we can apply the right kind of filtering technology and tune that up to get the results that we want to get. Now, I mentioned this notion of alerts, and talked about alerts are things that are out there in the environment, in many cases caused by human activity, but in other cases caused by nature. Alerts have this very limited bandwidth, and so they don't deliver much information. Now, in some cases, alerts have been tailored to carry a little bit more information. And what I mean by this is a ringing phone has a different sound normally than an alarm clock. And so we can distinguish in very gross, very vague terms what device or what channel is giving us the alert. So when you hear a ringing bell, for example, you have a pretty good idea that's an alarm clock versus a ringing telephone, which probably has a different kind of sound. So there's a little bit of information in these alerts, but they're not high bandwidth, at least not yet. Now, we've integrated alerts into many of our information channels. And we did that because we wanted to be alerted from some information channels. For example, if you have a process, a physical process, and it's got some temperature that it might reach that's a problem, then you can set up a bell that goes off when the temperature goes above a certain level, and it will alert you, and then you can go take steps to solve the problem. And so these things are useful things. And they've pretty much, I would say, always been associated with our computing technology. And this, to some degree, is from back in the day when computing time was very valuable. You wanted to know when a program had finished running, when it had done what it needed to do, so that you could move the computer on to the next thing. And so a lot of our alerts are that way. a resource alerts us when it's available. And then we have the opportunity to go utilize that resource or not as we choose. But this notion of alerts is kind of been built in to our technology for a long time. But we did that intentionally for better use. Modern devices, I talk a lot about, and you may or may not remember a time when your computer would announce that you had an email with a voice. You've got mail, right? AOL. And when we look at that, that was a nice to have. That was, hey, this is a cool, kitschy new thing. Yeah, I feel good because somebody sent me something. And that alerting technology has just been ingrained in a lot of information channels really ever since. And all of our information channels, well, almost all of them, really have some notion of an alert that you can set up. I got interested in this a little bit because I don't think that there has ever been a television that automatically came on at a prescribed time. Maybe there has been and I just overlooked it, but that would be an interesting form of alert would be, hey, I want to watch this show. So television, when this show comes on, let me know, ring a bell or turn yourself on or whatever that looks like. And that would be this notion of an alert. If we don't have alerts, then we have to be intentional about gathering information. And we still do this a lot. I mean, we go to the library to look for information. We go to Google to look for information. But many of our channels have this option that we can set that it'll say, hey, there's new information on this channel. Come look at it. Come look at it. So that intent for a long time was a very strong filter on our information. If it's intentional, if we have to have intent, then we more closely recognize the notion of scarce attention, probably through the notion of scarce time. Hey, I'd like to go to the library, but I've got meetings, and so I can't go today. I'll have to go some other time. And the alerting style of information channel bypasses that. So it tells us, hey, there's information out here. And the knowledge that there's information on a channel works in our brains and gives us a sense of urgency about consuming that information that maybe is not present with other kinds of channels that are more intentional by nature. And the bottom line is typically we have signed ourselves up for this, I'll say, self-alerting information. Typically, we at least have the option to turn the alert off. In other words, the alert being on may be the default behavior, but we usually have the option to turn that alert off. And that is a means of filtering. In some ways, the alerts bypass our filters if we're not using them carefully, which brings up this really interesting notion of trying to use an alert as a filter. And I think that we understand the notion of trying to do this. For example, if your chat app dings at you every time somebody puts something in the chat stream, and your email, you've turned the alerts off, okay, then you've really set up some sort of crude filter. And you said to yourself, I want the chat information to, in some ways, bypass my filter. And I'll be intentional about going to check the email information channel because I've turned off its alert. I would say perhaps we have confused these ideas and we're using alerts as filters. And in some ways, an alert can be a pretty poor filter. Typically, alerts don't have the same level of nuance, the same level of logic. Now, on your phone, you can set up alerts that are more sophisticated. For example, on my phone, I use an Android. I can set up Do Not Disturb, but then I can allow certain contacts to bypass the Do Not Disturb. So basically what I'm saying is, don't alert me for every time information gets put in this channel, but alert me when certain kinds of information gets put in this channel. And so you can see the similarities between filters and alerts. If we have that level of control on an alert, then it's probably, to the degree that we have that amount of control over an alert, then it's probably a somewhat better filter mechanism. But filters are made to keep things out such that we don't have to deal with them. Okay, so a filter is more like a spam filter. I'm told that some huge percentage, 99%, but that may be legend, of emails sent never gets received. It gets caught in the spam filters before we ever even see it. And that's probably a good thing, because if I don't know about you, but if I got 100 times as much email as I get now, I would be totally useless. Just the amount of information it takes to sort through the junk. And really, filters are attentional filters in some ways. We've pre-decided where we don't want to put our attention. And so since we don't want to put our attention there, we never see it, never see the packet of information on the channel. And thus, we don't even have to worry about determining whether or not it might be useful to us. We've pre-decided that. And so that's the power of these filters. And I mentioned the social media contract before, and I'll take a couple of minutes to talk about this because I haven't heard a lot about it. So when I say contract, I don't mean a legal document that we sign. I mean an agreement, often a tacit agreement on how we're going to behave, simply because we've chosen to engage in some, I'll say, information channel or some other activity. So the social contract, for example, for a telephone, and this is landline stuff. So when we had landlines, we had phone books. And if you had a number, if you had a phone number, then your name and phone number and probably address got published in the phone book, and it got distributed to everybody who had a telephone. So the social contract there is, yes, I have a telephone, and I understand that the number is going to be published. And so I'm largely giving permission for anybody who has a phone book and thinks they need to talk to me. I'm largely giving permission for them to reach out to me and ring my phone. And part of that social contract then is I'll answer the phone if I'm available, not in the shower, for example. And so this notion of a social contract is really interesting because we feel a responsibility to honor the social contract. And I'll give a pretty solid example of what I mean. In the social media context. So trying to define the social contract around social media is a little bit of a tricky thing because different people have different views. Well, that's always been true. If you had a landline and didn't want your number published in the directory, then you paid a fee, as I recall, every month to the phone company to leave you out of the directory. Well, that's kind of an interesting approach in the sense that you'd think it'd be just the other way around. Businesses paid to get into the directory and individuals paid to get out of the directory. So kind of an interesting business proposition there. But social contracts, and particularly the social contract around social media. I was talking to a colleague and I called him and he said, "Hey, I'm busy right now. Can I call you back in 30 minutes?" Sure. So he did. And the first thing he said when he got on the phone was, "Well, I realized that you should have been here." And what do you mean? And he said, "Well, I was having a networking get together for clients and such. We had some food and things." He said, "And I should have sent you an email." And I said, "Well, that's interesting." And he said, "But what I did instead is I announced it on Facebook." And this is a guy that knows full well that I'm not on Facebook. But it illustrates the social contract. So in his mind, he had made a broad public announcement of this thing, but it missed me completely. And so what's a legitimate social contract? And we laughed about it and went back and forth a little bit over, what a Luddite I am that I don't use much social media and don't use Facebook at all. And so we had a chuckle over it. And it wasn't a big deal to miss the meeting. And he promised that he would consider me a special case going forward. Now, whether he will or not, there's probably another way I can keep up with his social events. But it was an interesting insight into the media contract, into the, let's say, social contract around, different kinds of media. And just an insight there. When we get on social media, perhaps we decide to be friends with somebody. And I'm using Facebook terminology, but the same concept applies in many social media. And the social contract there, the tacit agreement, if you will, is if I'm following you on social media, then at some level I've indicated that I'm going to keep track of the information that you put on that information channel. And I don't know if we think about that very much when we agree to friend somebody on social media. And I think that social contract is increasingly true, and people feel more and more justified in saying, "Oh, I'm sorry that you didn't know about the event, but I put it on social media." And thinking about, well, isn't that kind of kind of an odd social contract? If I'm following you, then I'm sort of indicating that I will make myself aware of the information that you put out there, and sort of, again, tacitly agreeing that you don't have to reach out to me specially. You don't have to send me an invitation in an envelope because I'm, following you on some social media. And so thinking about that, and then thinking about, is that a filter? Because it's not a very nuanced filter. In most social media, if you follow someone, then you get everything that they post, as far as I know. So thinking about that in terms of these filters, I just thought was an interesting thought perspective. So we have these alerts available to us. Many of them are not terribly nuanced, so they don't perform as well as filters. So my argument is that we need both alerts and filters potentially. I don't use a lot of alerts on information channels, but I've built in intentional times to go and inspect those information channels and find the information that I think is important to me on those channels. But when we think about setting up alerts for information channels, we do have some psychological drive towards that. We talked about the social contract. Our curiosity is a real thing. we're afraid we're going to miss something. We're afraid that our friends are going to go do something fun that we didn't hear about, that our information set did not include this opportunity, all these kinds of things. And we have thought about this some over history. For example, 20 years ago, there was a large debate in the business world because if I had a cell phone, the company presumed that they could use that cell phone number to get a hold of me. Well, that was kind of weird because in other cases, if the company wanted to reach an employee, the company provided the cell phone. And so this debate over who's going to pay for this service that allows the company to alert people. And for a while, and I'm not sure if this is still true or not, but for a while, many people actually had two phones. And they had one that was for their own private use that they paid for, and they had another that was the company's provided. And so they dealt with these two devices pretty consistently. And the overhead cost of that is interesting as well. But we do have these, forces that tend to make us want to have alerts for information so that we don't miss something. And we've built that into our information channels in a lot of cases. I would say perhaps we also don't utilize filters, and this is one of the forces that drives our use of alerts. I'll say we don't utilize filters to the degree that we should because it takes time and effort. And it's easy to not do this well. And the cost of not doing it well is fairly small and incremental. And as our filters get worse and worse and worse over time, then their effectiveness goes down, getting worse. Their effectiveness goes down. We find ourselves getting more and more and more information off that channel. And we say, oh, well, that's just information overload. Well, in some cases, maybe. In other cases, perhaps it's people that have found ways to defeat our filters. And that means that we need to go back and make our filter, I'll use again the word better, in order to address that new ability to bypass it. So the value of our attention, which if you've listened to this podcast very long, you understand that I think is fairly high. The value of our attention drives our need and responsibility to utilize the tools and our need and responsibility to continually improve our filters, to maintain our filters, so to speak. If we don't do this, then over time, the forces in the modern culture will produce increasing amounts of information to us. As I said, people are working to defeat filters. People are working to bypass spam filters. People are working to get your attention such that you'll choose to ignore your filter. Those things are an increasing force in our world right now. And I want to think about whether or not you feel your attention is too wide open. And this is an explanation, a potential explanation for this notion of information overload, is that my attention is wide open because I haven't utilized the ability to create better and better filters. And if our attention is too open, then our attention is constantly being consumed with other people's attempts to get our attention, which may or may not be valuable to us. So thinking about, a system that has a filter versus a system that has no filter. There's going to be a lot of junk in the system with no filter. We filter our water, we filter many liquids. We filter our coffee because we don't want grounds in it. but we have to take the step to do that. There's nothing innate about coffee that the grounds won't interfere with our drinking of a hot beverage. So we have to put forth the effort of utilizing that filter well, and in some cases of improving the filter on our own. So you may be leaving your attention wide open. And in this sense, we're willing victims to this problem, or at least we're not fighting against it. We're not doing anything about it. But we do have tools that will help us avoid this challenge, this risk of our attention being used up in the wrong directions. And so we can do things about it. And I think that sometimes we need to be encouraged to do this effort to maintain our filters. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next few minutes. So there's many kinds of filters we can apply. So you don't have to subscribe to any social media. You don't have to install the app on your phone. And that produces challenges, but that's a trade-off. I think that the Facebook channel, it doesn't produce enough valuable information for me that I need to open that channel in my world. The amount of filtering that you can apply to a channel, and the filtering is usually channel specific. So it's not global. Quite often, it's not global. And when we look at a channel and decide whether we're going to open that channel, it might be wise to think at that point, what are the filtering capabilities on this channel? Am I opening myself up to every person in the world who thinks they have a need for my attention? Or am I able to control that to some degree? Because publishers of information, and I don't mean capital P businessman publishers, I mean people who put information into information channels, may not have your best interest at heart when they put information on that channel. And even your friends and your social contacts may not have your best interest at heart. They are publishing for self-interested reasons quite often. And their self-interest may coincide with your interest and it may not. And so as we look at that idea and we think, okay, well, yes, I'm going to open up this new information channel. Well, perhaps a wise approach to that is, okay, what kind of filters does it have? And can I throttle the amount of information in this channel? Is there technology that allows me to control the information flow and to attempt to let the good stuff through and keep the bad stuff away from my attention? And this decision is really a statistics problem. It's an average problem. It's how much value do we get out of the channel? And that value has two components. One part of that value is, out of 1,000 messages, how many are valuable to me? So that's one part of the equation. And then the other part of the equation is, on average, how valuable is each piece of information? And if we combine those two ideas, a channel that frequently has high value information is a good channel. And a channel that frequently has almost no information that we're interested in, and then the information that does get through is of relatively low value to us, then these are factors that we're going to want to take into account as we open up new information channels. And making that decision is usually not a trivial decision. With the growth of information and the growth in the ability for run-of-the-mill people to publish information on these channels, then we really need to think about them and to think about the fact of, yes, you can reach me, but here's how you can reach me. And these are the information channels that I consume on a regular basis. And these are not the information channels that I consume on a regular basis. And we do some thinking about that in more formal kinds of communication. I often reach out to people and I ask them if they would rather have an email conversation, a Zoom conversation, or just a phone call. And so what I'm doing is I'm setting up several channels and recognizing the other individual's preference among those channels. So finally, our takeaway, right? You want to recognize that a filter is not a set it and forget it thing. It doesn't necessarily maintain its effectiveness over an extended period of time. And this was really the point of Clay Shirky's article, was if you feel like you're overwhelmed, then you do have tools at your disposal. So he says it's not a problem of the amount of information growing. It's a problem of the kinds of information on any channel defeating our filters. And then we have to go back and we have to say, okay, well, let me make my filter stronger. So this maintenance of our filters. And in order to counteract the forces that we talked about earlier, our native curiosity, fear of missing out, all these kinds of things, we have to be sort of ruthless with our filters. It's possible that we make an error when we say, well, this might be useful occasionally, so I'm going to let it through. And we talked about that with thinking about the value of information and the potential value of a single packet of information as we decide which channels to use and we decide how tight our filters should be. I know lots of people that have a strong customer service focus in their business who don't use the phone filters, and they'll answer any call. I have a more nuanced filter, which is I put on do not disturb, and only certain people can make my phone audibly ring. Everybody else goes to voicemail. And there are all kinds of shades of gray in there because of how the tools will allow us to set them up. In other words, the capabilities of the filtering systems there. But the takeaway is go ahead and recognize that you need to be proactive about this. And even if you've got filters in place, continue to monitor those channels and how often you ask those value questions about those channels on a fairly consistent basis. And if you find that the value proposition is not there for you, then recognize that you may be wasting some of your attention there. When I say be ruthless about your filters, there's really sound support for that, because we need to also recognize that human communication is pretty fault tolerant. And this is an idea that I got from Cal Newport, and it's not uncommon sense, but the phrasing is very good. If somebody that has your best interest at heart wants you to receive some valuable information, then they'll try pretty hard to get that information to you. And if they're not willing to try pretty hard to get that information to you, then, hey, maybe it wasn't that important to begin with. But, back to my friend who I missed his social gathering, he would not, if he needed to meet with me about the fact that I wasn't paying his bill, I'm one of his customers. If he needed to check with me about the fact that I wasn't paying his bill and he was about to have to cut off my service, he would not have posted that to me on Facebook. he would have, maybe he might have tried that, but if I didn't respond, he would have used other mechanisms to try to get my attention on this matter. And so the phrase human communication is pretty fault tolerant is one that encapsulates this idea fairly well, at least from my perspective. So think about that as well. If somebody who cares about you has important information for you, then they'll try pretty hard to get it to you and make sure that they get your attention. So let's summarize. We talked about this notion of filters and the fact that we do have tools at our disposal, and the fact that much of what we feel as information overload is, in fact, as Shirky said, filter failure. And we can go in and we can fix those filters rather than just being a victim of this increased waste of our attention. So we talked about alerts and how they often differ from filters. They merge in some areas, but I think it would be good practice for us to treat alerts and filters in somewhat different ways. So whether the information on a channel gets our attention or not is really what we're talking about. We talked about, yes, we need information. Information can be important to us both for social reasons and for business reasons, but that sometimes our curiosity gets the better of us, and we want to acquire more information than is actually good for us. There used to be a phrase that we would throw around, and the phrase was curiosity killed the cat. And the notion was parents would say that to children when children were trying to find out something that they just didn't need to know, like rooting around in the closet to see what the Christmas presents were. But we do have forces that drive us to open ourselves to information and just recognize that our information is a limited quantity and that it's very valuable. And so some incentive to question that instinct towards consuming more and more and more information over time, and leaving our attention too wide open. That's too many alerts, too many channels, filters that aren't doing what they're supposed to do. And then finally, this notion of expect to have to maintain those filters. Expect to spend some time and calculate that in when you consider the value of an information channel. So we talked about the value proposition of information. How frequently are information packets valuable, and what's the average value of an information packet? And then also factoring into that math is a question of, okay, well, what's it going to take to maintain any filters that I need on this channel such that it doesn't overconsume and waste my attention? So just some broader thoughts, but I thought the mental image of a filter would be useful to refresh in your mind. And so I wanted to get that out to you as a way to help you think about how to deal with these attentional challenges in our lives. So I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusywrite.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.